Imagine a country so committed to freedom that it gave every single nobleman the power to veto any law in the land. One man, one word, and the entire government grinds to a halt. Now imagine that country surrounded by three of the most ruthless, expansionist empires in European history. How long do you think it survives? This is the story of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, once the largest country in Europe, a place that called itself a noble democracy 2 centuries before the American Revolution. A state that produced some of the most radical ideas about liberty and self-governance the world had ever seen. And it is also the story of how those very ideals, pushed to their logical extreme, became the mechanism of its own destruction. Here is what should haunt you about this story. The Commonwealth did not fall because it was weak from the start. It fell because it was, in a very specific sense, too principled, or rather because its principles were captured, corrupted, and weaponized by the very people who were supposed to uphold them. And by the time anyone understood what was happening, 3 neighboring empires had already carved the country off the map, not once, but 3 times. How does a nation that pioneered religious tolerance in an age of brutal religious wars end up erased from the map? How does a parliament that met for centuries become so paralyzed it cannot pass a single law? And who was really pulling the strings when it all collapsed? Stay with us. The answers are more surprising and more relevant than you might expect. If you find this kind of deep historical storytelling valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. It genuinely helps us keep making these videos and reaching people who love history done right. To understand how the Commonwealth died, we need to understand what it actually was, because most people outside of Poland and Lithuania have no idea, and that ignorance does a serious injustice to one of history's most fascinating political experiments. We are in the 16th century Europe. Is a continent of kings, emperors, and absolute monarchs. The idea that a ruler's power comes from God and flows downward is not just political theory, it is the organizing principle of almost every major state on the continent. France has its Sun King. Spain has its Habsburg monarchs. Russia is building toward the Tsars. The general direction of European politics is toward centralization, toward stronger royal authority, toward what historians would later call absolutism. And then there is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In 1569, the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania formally merged into a single political entity through the Union of Lublin. This was not a conquest, it was a negotiated union, and the resulting state was something genuinely new in the world. The Commonwealth stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea steppe in the south, covering roughly 400,000 square miles at its peak. To put that in perspective, it was larger than France and Spain combined. It encompassed what is today Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, and parts of Estonia and Russia. But the size is not the remarkable part. The structure is. The Commonwealth was governed by a parliament called the Sejm, which had been developing since the 15th century. And the people who sat in that parliament, the Szlachta, the Polish-Lithuanian nobility, held a degree of political power that was extraordinary for the era. At its height, the Szlachta numbered somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million people, depending on the period, which represented roughly 8 to 10% of the total population. That is an astonishing proportion. In France or England, the nobility was a tiny sliver of society. In the Commonwealth, it was a mass political class, and every single one of them, in theory, was equal. A poor nobleman farming a small plot of land had the same legal standing as a great magnate controlling vast estates. They could all vote, they could all speak in the Sejm. They could all, in theory, become king, because here is the other extraordinary feature of the Commonwealth. The king was elected. When a king died, the throne did not automatically pass to his son. Instead, the Szlachta gathered in enormous open-air assemblies, sometimes numbering in the tens of thousands, and voted for the next ruler. This was called the free election, and it was considered one of the Commonwealth's proudest achievements. No dynastic succession, no hereditary tyranny. The king served at the pleasure of the nobility. Now, before you imagine this as some kind of early democracy, it is important to be precise about what it was and what it was not. The Szlachta were the political nation. Peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, had no political rights whatsoever. In fact, serfdom became increasingly entrenched in the Commonwealth during this same period, meaning that as the nobility celebrated their freedoms, the peasants beneath them were being legally bound to the land in conditions that historians describe as a second serfdom. The Commonwealth's freedom was a freedom for a specific class, not for humanity in general. That distinction matters enormously, but within that class the ideals were genuine and fiercely held. and one of those ideals was about to become a catastrophic vulnerability. Here is the wow fact that stops most people cold when they first hear it. In 1652, a minor nobleman named Władysław Syczynski stood up in the Sejm and said one word, or rather two words in Latin, nie pozwalam. I do not allow it. And with that, he dissolved the entire parliamentary session. Every piece of legislation that had been debated for weeks simply ceased to exist. The session was over. This was the liberum veto in action, and it was entirely legal. The liberum veto, the free veto, was based on the principle that since every nobleman was equal, any single member of the Sejm could block any legislation he disagreed with. The logic had a certain internal consistency. If you genuinely believed that every nobleman's voice carried equal weight, then majority rule was itself a form of tyranny, the tyranny of the many over the one. True freedom required unanimity. Any law that could not achieve universal consent was, by definition, an imposition on someone's liberty. It sounds almost philosophically elegant until you try to run a government with it. The liberum veto had existed in various informal forms before 1652, but Syczynski's use of it set a precedent that proved impossible to walk back. After that moment, every session of the Sejm operated under the shadow of potential dissolution by a single dissenting voice. And it got worse. Not only could a single deputy end a session, but after a certain point, using the veto also nullified all legislation passed in that same session, even the laws that had already been agreed upon. It was a political nuclear option available to any one of hundreds of deputies. Between 1652 and 1764, roughly half of all Sejm sessions were dissolved by the liberum veto. Some historians put the number even higher for certain periods. The government of the Commonwealth was, for stretches of its later history, functionally paralyzed. But here is what is crucial to understand, and this is where the story gets darker. The liberum veto was not just a structural flaw that emerged from naive idealism. It was also a tool, a weapon. And foreign powers understood its potential long before most Polish and Lithuanian statesmen did. To understand who was watching from the outside, we need to step back and look at the geopolitical map of 17th century Europe. The Commonwealth had three neighbors who would eventually become its destroyers: Russia to the east, Prussia to the west, and Austria to the south. Each of them was moving in the opposite political direction from the Commonwealth. Each of them was centralizing power, building professional armies, reforming tax systems, and expanding state capacity. The Commonwealth, by contrast, was constitutionally incapable of doing any of those things because any attempt at reform could be vetoed by a single deputy. Russia under Peter the Great and his successors was transforming itself into a modern autocratic empire with a standing army and an aggressive foreign policy. Prussia under the Hohenzollern dynasty was building what would become one of the most efficient military machines in European history. Austria, under the Habsburgs, was consolidating its hold over Central Europe. All three of these powers had an interest in the Commonwealth remaining weak. A strong, reformed Commonwealth would be a formidable neighbor. A paralyzed Commonwealth was a buffer state, a source of territory when needed, and a diplomatic playground. And so they began to invest in paralysis. The mechanism was elegant and deeply cynical. Foreign ambassadors, Russian, Prussian, and later others, began paying Polish and Lithuanian nobles to use the liberum veto at critical moments. When the Sejm was about to pass a tax reform that would fund a larger army, a well-placed bribe to a minor deputy could dissolve the session before the vote was taken. When military appropriations were on the table, a single veto could prevent them. The cost of maintaining the Commonwealth's dysfunction was a fraction of what it would cost to fight it militarily. This is one of the most important and often underappreciated facts about the Commonwealth's decline. Yes, the liberum veto was a genuine expression of the nobility's political ideology, but its most destructive applications in the later 17th and early 18th centuries were frequently engineered from abroad. Polish and Lithuanian nobles were, in many cases, not simply exercising their freedom, they were being paid by foreign powers to exercise it at precisely the right moments. The Commonwealth's greatest freedom had become a foreign policy instrument of its enemies. Now let us introduce the human dimension of this story, because history is not just about systems and structures. It is about people making choices under pressure. The early 17th century was actually a period of remarkable Commonwealth power. Under King Stefan Batory in the late 16th century, and then under the Vasa dynasty, The Commonwealth fought wars against Russia, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire simultaneously, and held its own, sometimes more than held its own. In 1610, a Commonwealth army actually captured Moscow. Polish and Lithuanian forces occupied the Kremlin for nearly 2 years. The idea that the Commonwealth was always weak is a myth worth correcting early. But the mid-17th century brought a series of catastrophes that the Commonwealth's political system was simply not equipped to handle. In 1648, a massive Cossack uprising broke out in the Ukrainian territories of the Commonwealth, led by a military commander named Bohdan Khmelnytsky. The Cossacks were a semi-autonomous military caste living in the eastern borderlands, and their grievances were real: religious discrimination, social exclusion from the Szlachta class, and the expansion of serfdom into their territories. Khmelnytsky's uprising was not just a military rebellion, it was a social revolution, and it unleashed violence on a scale that devastated large parts of Ukraine and destabilized the entire Eastern Commonwealth. Then Sweden invaded from the north. This period, known in Polish history as the Deluge, the Potop, saw Swedish armies sweep through the Commonwealth between 1655 and 1660, occupying Warsaw, Krakow, and vast stretches of the country. The human cost was staggering. Estimates vary, but many historians believe the Commonwealth lost somewhere between a quarter and a third of its population during the mid-17th century catastrophes through war, famine, and epidemic. Some regions may have lost even more. The Commonwealth survived these crises, but it emerged profoundly weakened, economically, demographically, and politically. The institutions that might have rebuilt the state were the same institutions that were now being paralyzed by the liberum veto. The window for reform was narrowing with every passing decade. And into this weakening structure stepped one of history's most consequential and most controversial figures in the Commonwealth's story. Augustus II, known as Augustus the Strong, became king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1697 through a contested election. He converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism specifically to make himself eligible, which tells you something about the transactional nature of the free election by this point. He was simultaneously Elector of Saxony, which meant the Commonwealth was now in a personal union with a German state, with a king whose primary power base lay outside the country he nominally ruled. Augustus had ambitions. He wanted to reclaim territories in the Baltic, which brought the Commonwealth into the Great Northern War against Sweden, a conflict that lasted from 1700 to 1721. The war was a disaster for the Commonwealth, though not primarily a military one. The real damage was that it invited Russian forces into Commonwealth territory under the pretext of being allies. Tsar Peter the Great understood immediately what the Commonwealth's political structure meant. A country that could not pass military appropriations, could not maintain a professional standing army, and could not coordinate a coherent foreign policy was not really a sovereign state in any meaningful sense. Peter began cultivating relationships with Polish and Lithuanian magnates. He guaranteed the Commonwealth's constitution, meaning he guaranteed its dysfunction. When reformers within the Sejm tried to pass measures that would strengthen the state, Russian diplomatic and financial pressure worked to prevent them. The Commonwealth was becoming, slowly and then all at once, a Russian protectorate in everything but name. This is the turning point that is easy to miss because it happened gradually, through bribery and diplomacy rather than through battle. The Commonwealth did not lose its sovereignty in a single dramatic defeat. It lost it incrementally, one vetoed Sejm session at a time. By the mid-18th century, the situation had reached a kind of terrible equilibrium. The Commonwealth existed. It had a king, a parliament, an army. Though the army was embarrassingly small compared to its neighbors, limited by constitutional constraints on military spending, it had a functioning legal system and a cultural life that was, in many ways, vibrant. The Commonwealth of the 18th century was producing philosophers, poets, and political thinkers of real distinction, but it could not govern itself effectively. And everyone who paid attention knew it. Here is the second wow fact, and it is almost unbearably poignant. In the 1760s, a group of Polish reformers, genuinely brilliant, genuinely patriotic people, began pushing for constitutional changes that would abolish the liberum veto and modernize the state. They understood the problem with perfect clarity. They wrote about it with sophistication and urgency, and they were blocked at every turn, sometimes by domestic conservatives who genuinely believed that any weakening of noble liberties was a step toward tyranny, and sometimes by foreign powers who were paying those conservatives to believe exactly that. The reformers were not wrong. They were simply too late, and the forces arrayed against them were too powerful and too patient. In 1764, Stanislaw August Poniatowski became the last king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. His election was engineered by Catherine the Great of Russia, who had been his lover and who saw him as a useful instrument of Russian influence. Poniatowski was not a simple Russian puppet. He was a genuinely intelligent and reform-minded man who spent his reign trying to modernize the country he loved, often in direct conflict with the power that had placed him on the throne. But his position was always structurally compromised, and Catherine was always willing to remind him of that. Under Poniatowski, the reformers made their most serious and most dramatic attempt to save the Commonwealth. The year is 1788, the Sejm convenes in Warsaw, and this particular session will last 4 years. It will become known as the Great Sejm, or the 4-year Sejm, and it is one of the most remarkable legislative assemblies in European history. The reformers had been waiting for this moment. Russia was distracted, fighting wars against the Ottoman Empire and Sweden simultaneously, which meant Catherine's attention and resources were stretched. The window for genuine reform was narrow, but it was open. And the reformers knew it. What emerged from those 4 years of debate, argument, and political maneuvering was the Constitution of the 3rd of May, 1791. It was adopted on May 3rd, 1791, and here is the third wow fact, making it the first written national constitution in the world after the United States Constitution, and by some arguments, the first in Europe. It predated the French Constitution of 1791 by several months. The Constitution of the 3rd of May was a genuine revolution in Polish political thinking. It abolished the liberum veto. It replaced the free election with hereditary monarchy to provide political stability. It gave the bourgeoisie, the urban middle class, political rights for the first time. It took steps toward improving the condition of the peasantry, though it stopped short of abolishing serfdom outright. It created a genuine separation of powers and established a modern cabinet government. The reformers who wrote it knew they were racing against time. They actually used a clever procedural trick to pass it. They called the session during a holiday period when many conservative deputies were absent from Warsaw, and they moved quickly before opposition could organize. The vote was taken on May 3rd, and the constitution was adopted amid scenes of genuine popular enthusiasm. King Poniatowski, who had supported the reform, took an oath to uphold it on the steps of the castle in Warsaw. Crowds cheered in the streets. For a brief, extraordinary moment, it seemed as though the Commonwealth might actually save itself. It lasted 14 months. The opponents of the Constitution, conservative magnates who genuinely believed their ancient liberties were being destroyed, and who were, in many cases, also in communication with foreign powers, formed a confederation at a town called Targowica in May 1792. The Confederation of Targowica called on Catherine the Great to intervene and restore the old constitution. Catherine obliged. Russian armies crossed the Commonwealth's borders in May 1792. The Commonwealth's reformed military, which the 4-year Sejm had worked to build up, fought back and fought surprisingly well, including a notable engagement at the Battle of Zielince, which is still commemorated in Polish military history. But the disparity in forces was overwhelming. Russia deployed roughly 100,000 soldiers. The Commonwealth had roughly 37,000, and the political situation was deteriorating faster than the military one. Poniatowski, facing what seemed like certain defeat and hoping to negotiate terms that might preserve some version of the reformed state, made the agonizing decision to join the Confederation of Targowica himself. It was a capitulation that destroyed his reputation among the reformers who had trusted him, though historians continue to debate whether any other choice would have produced a better outcome. The constitution was annulled. The liberum veto was restored. And then came the second partition. In 1793, Russia and Prussia, without even consulting Austria this time, simply took large chunks of the Commonwealth. Russia took much of what is today Belarus and Ukraine. Prussia took the city of Danzig and a swath of Western territory. The Commonwealth, already reduced from its 17th century peak, shrank again. What remained was a rump state, surrounded, humiliated, and occupied. The response to the partition was an uprising. In 1794, a military commander named Tadeusz Kościuszko, who had served in the American Revolutionary War and helped fortify West Point, returned to Poland and launched an insurrection. The Kościuszko uprising was the Commonwealth's last military attempt to restore its sovereignty and, significantly, to complete the social revolution that the Constitution of May 3rd had begun. Kościuszko issued the Proclamation of Polaniec, which promised freedom and land rights to peasants who joined the uprising. This was radical. This was genuinely revolutionary. For the first time in the Commonwealth's history, a major political leader was extending the promise of liberty beyond the Schlachter to the people who actually worked the land. The uprising achieved some remarkable early successes. At the Battle of Raklovice in April 1794, Kosciuszko's forces, including peasant volunteers armed with scythes, defeated a Russian force in a battle that became legendary in Polish national memory. For a moment, the impossible seemed possible. But the coalition of forces arrayed against the uprising was simply too powerful. Russia, Prussia, and eventually Austria all sent forces to suppress it. By November 1794, the uprising had been crushed. Kosciuszko himself was wounded and captured. Warsaw fell. And in 1795, the three neighboring powers completed what they had started. In the third partition, Russia, Prussia, and Austria divided the remaining territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth among themselves. The country that had existed for over 2 centuries, the country that had produced the first written constitution in Europe, that had pioneered religious tolerance, that had governed itself through a parliament when most of Europe was ruled by absolute monarchs, ceased to exist as a political entity. It would not reappear on the map of Europe for 123 years. Now we need to sit with the question that this story raises, because it is genuinely complex and historians have been arguing about it for 2 centuries. Was the Commonwealth's destruction inevitable? Was it the victim of its own idealism, or was it the victim of its neighbor's aggression? The answer, honestly, is that it was both, and the interaction between those 2 factors is what makes the story so instructive. The liberum veto and the free election were not simply naive mistakes. They were expressions of a genuine political philosophy, the belief that liberty was the highest political value and that any concentration of power was a threat to it. That philosophy produced real achievements. The Warsaw Confederation of 1573, which guaranteed religious freedom to all faiths in the Commonwealth, was enacted at a time when France was massacring Protestants in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre and the Spanish Inquisition was at its height. The Commonwealth's record on religious tolerance was, for its era, genuinely remarkable. But that same philosophy, applied to the mechanics of government, created a state that could not defend itself, could not tax itself adequately, and could not reform itself when reform became urgently necessary. The liberum veto was the logical endpoint of a political culture that treated any constraint on individual noble freedom as tyranny, even when that constraint was the minimum necessary for collective survival. And then there is the external dimension. The Commonwealth's neighbors did not simply wait for it to collapse. They actively worked to prevent it from reforming. The bribing of deputies to use the liberum veto, the diplomatic pressure to maintain the old constitution, the military intervention against the Constitution of May 3rd, these were deliberate policies of powerful states that understood, with cold clarity, that a weak Commonwealth served their interests better than a strong one. This is why the story of the Commonwealth is not simply a cautionary tale about the dangers of too much freedom. It is also a story about what happens when powerful external actors exploit the genuine vulnerabilities of a principled but imperfect political system. The Commonwealth's flaws were real, but those flaws were also weaponized. The short-term consequences of the partitions were devastating in the most immediate human sense. Millions of people who had been citizens of the Commonwealth suddenly found themselves subjects of Russia, Prussia, or Austria. Languages changed. Laws changed. The administrative structures that had governed daily life for generations were dismantled and replaced. Polish and Lithuanian elites who had defined themselves through their political participation in the Sejm found that participation simply gone. The Schlachter, the class whose freedoms had defined the Commonwealth, faced a particularly painful reckoning. In the Russian partition, many nobles who had participated in the Kosciuszko uprising had their estates confiscated. The Prussian administration worked systematically to replace Polish landowners with German settlers in some areas. The social world that had sustained the Commonwealth's political culture was being deliberately dismantled. But the longer-term consequences are where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth died as a state in 1795, but the idea of Poland, and to a lesser extent, the idea of Lithuania, did not die with it. In fact, the partitions produced something that the Commonwealth's political culture had never quite managed to generate, a sense of national identity that crossed class lines. As long as the Commonwealth existed, the political nation was the Schlachter. Peasants were subjects, not citizens. But after the partitions, the experience of foreign occupation began, slowly and unevenly, to create a broader sense of Polish identity that included people who had previously been excluded from the political nation. The uprisings of the 19th century, in 1830, in 1848, in 1863, were not just noble rebellions. They increasingly involved people from across the social spectrum. Kosciuszko's proclamation at Polanik, extending the promise of freedom to the peasantry, was ahead of its time in 1794, but it pointed toward the future. The Poland that eventually re-emerged in 1918 was built on a much broader conception of citizenship than the Commonwealth had ever achieved. The cultural legacy of the Commonwealth is profound and still underappreciated in the broader historical conversation. The Constitution of May 3, 1791, that document that lasted only 14 months, became a symbol of enormous power. It was celebrated, mourned, and invoked for generations. It demonstrated that Polish and Lithuanian political thinkers had not only understood the problems of their system, but had devised sophisticated solutions to them. The failure of the Constitution was not a failure of ideas. It was a failure of power. The power to implement those ideas against the determined opposition of stronger neighbors. The Commonwealth also left a complicated legacy for the successor states that emerged from its territory. Poland, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine all have complicated relationships with the Commonwealth's memory. For Poland, it is largely a story of a golden age and a tragic fall. For Lithuania, the relationship is more ambivalent. The Union of Lublin that created the Commonwealth is sometimes viewed as the beginning of a process that gradually marginalized Lithuanian language and culture in favor of Polish. For Belarus and Ukraine, the Commonwealth's legacy includes both the genuine achievements of its political culture and the reality of serfdom and social exclusion that characterized life for most of its population. History, as always, looks different depending on where you are standing. What does this story mean for us, watching from the distance of centuries? There is a temptation to draw simple lessons from the Commonwealth's fall. Too much freedom is dangerous. Veto power should be limited. Unanimity requirements are impractical. All of that is true, in a narrow sense, but the deeper lesson is more unsettling. The Commonwealth's political culture was not simply naive. It was sophisticated, principled, and in many ways admirable. Its practitioners understood, at least in the abstract, the tensions between liberty and order, between individual rights and collective capacity. The problem was not that they failed to think carefully about these tensions. The problem was that the structural incentives of their system rewarded the defense of individual privilege over the cultivation of collective strength, and that those structural incentives were then exploited by external powers with very different values. There is something almost unbearably modern about this story, a political system built on the principle that any individual should be able to block collective action. A culture that treats any attempt at reform as a threat to freedom, external actors who benefit from that paralysis and work to maintain it. The gap between a system's stated ideals and its actual functioning. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was not destroyed by its enemies alone. It was destroyed by the interaction between its own internal contradictions and the ruthless strategic calculations of the powers that surrounded it. It was a country that loved freedom so much that it built freedom into its constitution in ways that made governance nearly impossible, and then watched as that constitutional freedom was purchased and deployed by foreign agents to ensure that governance remained impossible. The reformers of the four-year Sejm understood this. Kosciuszko understood this. Poniatowski, in his complicated and compromised way, understood this. They tried. They came heartbreakingly close. The Constitution of May 3rd was a genuine achievement, a document that deserved a better fate than the one it received. But the armies were already marching. In the end, the story of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is a story about the relationship between ideals and institutions, between what a society believes and what its structures actually enable. The Commonwealth believed in freedom. It built institutions to protect freedom, and those institutions over time became the mechanism by which freedom was destroyed, not by tyrants imposing their will from above, but by the accumulated weight of individual choices, foreign interference, and the slow erosion of the collective capacity to act. It is a story that ends in erasure, a country removed from the map, its name gone from official documents, its language suppressed in schools and churches. But it is also a story that ends in resilience, because the ideas did not die with the state. They went underground. They traveled with emigrants to Paris and London, and eventually to the Americas. They were kept alive in poetry and music and memory, and 123 years after the last partition, Poland reappeared on the map of Europe. The Commonwealth itself was gone, but the argument it had been having with itself about freedom, about power, about who belongs to the political nation and who does not, that argument continued. It continues still. Some arguments are too important to end just because the country that started them disappears. So, here is the question I want to leave you with. The Commonwealth had reformers who understood the problem perfectly. They wrote a brilliant constitution. They had a brief window of opportunity, and they were defeated by a combination of internal resistance and foreign intervention. Was the outcome inevitable? Or was there a moment, a decision, a battle, a political choice, where things could genuinely have gone differently? What do you think was the decisive factor, the structural flaws built into the Commonwealth from the beginning, or the deliberate actions of its neighbors to prevent reform? Write your answer in the comments. I read every one of them, and this is genuinely one of those historical debates where the answer is not obvious. If this kind of history, deep, honest, without myths or easy answers, is what you come here for, then subscribing to the channel is the best way to make sure you do not miss the next one. It takes real time and research to do this properly, and your support is what makes it possible. In the next video, we are going to look at the other side of this story, the three empires that carved up the Commonwealth and what they thought they were getting. Because Russia, Prussia, and Austria each had very different visions for the territories they absorbed, and the consequences of those differences played out across the next century and a half in ways that shaped the world we live in today. The story of the partitions did not end in 1795. In many ways, it was just beginning.